finish with Meg. So this talk is about kind of getting started with DH and figuring out the right tools for the type of work you want to do. So take it away, Meg.
Thanks, Christine. Yes, so get this going here. So as Christine said, as my poor computer loads, it's getting very tired. Welcome to the third and final Morning Bytes session. Here we're going to be coming back a little bit to some of the stuff we talked about in the first Morning Bytes session, where we were talking about what to do with your data and how the ways that you structure your data or how you use it might depend a little bit on the tool that you're using. So get everything situated here. I'm dual wielding my laptops here. So today I thought we'd talk a little bit about a related phase of project development, which is finding the right tool for your project. I will say that projects and project timelines come in lots of different shapes. So this process of looking for tools might come at any different point as you're developing a project. So maybe you've got a data set that you've been collecting for a while, you've cleaned it up, you know exactly how you want to analyze it or visualize it. And in that case, maybe you are trying to find the tools that do those specific things and evaluate the pros and cons for your specific situation. On the other hand, maybe you've got a collection of materials that you want to curate or exhibit. And so then you're thinking not only about what those tools can do, but also about how they might shape the narrative or argument that you're presenting. And maybe you just went to a webinar and saw some super cool project that sent your head spinning about how you might apply those tools or those methods to your materials. So then you've got an idea about what tool you want, but you're sort of figuring out what its pros and cons are, what its implications are on the fly. And sometimes this process of tool discovery is just about figuring out what the possibilities are. That's the case no matter how long you've been in the field, by the way, because new tools are coming out all the time and it's impossible to keep up with all of them. So every now and then it can be really fun and really exciting to just sort of survey the field. So no matter what the scenario is or when it happens in the life cycle of your project, these processes of tool discovery and tool evaluation are a really critical part of building a solid DH project. Because just like, analog research, right? These tools and methods that we use do, of course, impact our research, our teaching, our outreach. And as I've said before, and will continue to say, computers and software feel neutral, but each tool we use is grounded in its own assumptions, has ways of thinking about information and arguments sort of hardwired into it. And the choice of tool impacts both our own experience as creators and the experience of the users who are trying to access our work. So what I'm going to do today is take a little while to talk about some strategies for finding and evaluating DH tools and for how to sort of mesh them with your project. So if you're coming to this with a project in mind, it's important to think about your project first, right? Your project might evolve, it will evolve, but even getting just a rudimentary sense of your project before you start is going to help you figure out your priorities when it comes to choosing a tool. And we're going to keep coming back to priorities because a lot of these questions are really about your preferences and the needs of your specific project. So the first thing, of course, is what your project's going to do in sort of broad strokes. What's its purpose? Is it research? Is it pedagogy? Is it public facing? And the related question then of who's your audience and what broad umbrella does it fit under? Obviously, if you've got a project in mind, you probably already have these sorted out. But in digital humanities, sometimes the lines between these categories blur a little bit, and scope creep's always sort of a danger. And sometimes tools are going to shape your project in ways you didn't expect and send you in a slightly different direction. So it's good to articulate these as specifically as you can kind of at the outset and just sort of create a baseline for yourself. Obviously, the question of your available resources is a really crucial one. How much time do you plan on dedicating to this project? Do you have a lot of time to learn new things, or are you working on a deadline? Maybe your own, maybe someone else's. Are there tools that might do some of the things that you want that you're already familiar with? That might or might not be the best option, but it's worth considering because, of course, we all have tons of free time, right? And do you have resources, financial or otherwise, to invest in learning new technologies? None of these resource questions are going to make or break a project. And remember, that's part of what we're here for. But they are undeniable factors in choosing the right tool. And then finally, what part of the project is this tool going to help with? Is it primarily something for planning or managing the project? Is it something you're going to use as you produce content? Maybe something that produces visualizations or runs analyses? Or is it something that your audience is going to interact with? We'll come back to all of these in a bit because these are all really crucial questions for evaluation. So first, let's kind of lay out a few more initial thoughts about tool discovery, and then we'll get to the actual resources. People, like I said, kind of come to digital humanities through a lot of different entry points. Some people already have a sense of what they want to do. They've got a project and methodology in mind. And so this process of tool discovery is about finding that tool that does that specific thing. So if you know what you want to do, the first thing is to figure out what it's called. And that sounds obvious, I know, but there are a couple of pieces here. The first is that often we'll come into projects with a broad idea of the digital outputs that we want, right? For instance, this project includes a lot of spatial data, so I want to include a mapping component. But of course, the umbrella of mapping covers a multitude of applications and outputs. So you might need to break it down a little bit and figure out what specific application you want your map to sort of serve. Is it an illustration of to support your argument? Is it a way for users to explore your data? Is it a tool for analysis? All of those things use maps, they produce maps, but they're doing very different things. So thinking about whether you're looking for map-based storytelling or interactive maps, or maybe a GIS application will help you tailor your search then. A related facet of this is that sometimes different fields have different vocabularies, so it can be really productive to find people across different fields who are using similar methods and see what tools they're using and what they're calling it and how they're framing it. So a sort of DH lit review. But not everyone does have a tool in mind. And like I've said, sometimes it's more about wanting to see what's out there, to get a sense of those possibilities. So then maybe you're focusing less on the tools and more on how people are engaging with data like yours, with questions like yours, through a digital lens. So with all that preliminary stuff out of the way, let's look at some specific ways to find DH tools. One of my personal favorites is to look at existing projects. I think there's sometimes an idea that digital humanities is first and foremost about new technologies, about developing new tools or new processes. And that's important and very exciting work. But the point of developing those new tools is that other people will eventually use them too, right? That they have widespread applications beyond their creators' test cases. So I like to occasionally sort of peruse some of the existing scholarship in the field to see what other people are doing and how they're doing it. And probably my favorite general resource for that is Reviews in DH, which I've got open somewhere. There we go. Reviews in DH, which is a combination of a project registry and a set of, as the title would suggest, project reviews. And it's not discipline specific, which I think is one of its biggest strengths for this sort of tool discovery process. So you can sort of survey the field, and then you can see not only how scholars are using these tools, but how users and readers are interacting with them, how it shapes their experience of the project. So, for instance, do you want to see what the medievalists are doing in digital humanities? Sorted by time period. Do you want to see what the archaeologists are up to? Sorted by field of study. Do you want to look for instance, the latest developments or the newest projects in something like wearable technologies? Then you can sort it by topic or methodology. So it's a really nice way to sort of see what's out there. And then if you click through to one of the project reviews, oh, bad news for 3D printing, I guess. Oh no. There we go. So if you click through to one of the project reviews, you can see that it contains both sort of how the project creators conceptualize their project, how they describe it. And then you can also see how the reviewers are evaluating both the content, the sort of field-specific content, and also the use of technology. So reviews in DH is, in my opinion, probably the best one-stop shop for project discovery or for tool discovery. But there are lots of others. So you can see I've got RIDE up here, which is a similar repository for reviews of digital editions. There are lots of field-specific resources. So I've listed a few here, but there are lots of others. If you're looking for something specific, feel free to chat with me and we'll see what we can find. Another place to look is recent scholarship. So reviews in DH showcases projects that have reached at least some initial stage of completion, even if they're not in their final form yet. But the last year has seen some really exciting launches of new projects too. And for all the Zoom fatigue and general pandemic fatigue, I will say that one of the upsides of turning virtual is that it's opened up windows on so many people's scholarship. And I suspect that's going to continue. So you can look for things like webinar repositories and the archives of recent virtual conferences and see what people have in development. I've linked the webinar repository here for Digital Medievalist, but there are lots of others. And finally, if you have a sense of the field, or if you want to be really targeted in your search, there are lots of tool directories out there, which of course are exactly what they sound like. And I've listed a couple here, but there are, again, many more. So once you've got a sense of what the options are, and generally there are several options for any given process, how do you evaluate them for your project? Some of the questions you'll ask are pros and cons. No tool can be all things for all people. So again, it comes back to your priorities. If you're the only one using this tool to run an analysis, for instance, you might not care as much about something like a long-term subscription cost or how attractive the user interface is. But you might be very concerned with how much time you have to invest in learning the tool. So here are a few of those pros and cons to consider. The first is usability. That might mean just sort of an intuitive interface, but it might also include things like accessibility issues. Is the website set up so that screen readers can read it? Does the website design, things like fonts and colors, meet best practices? If you have questions, is there a set of resources that you can consult? And lots of other things that might pop up. Another obvious one is how much does it cost for you and for your user? And sort of related to that, what kind of computer do you need to run the program? Does it eat up a lot of bandwidth? And what are the opportunity costs? So how much time is it going to take to learn this tool? And equally important, how long do you need to experiment with it to know whether it'll really work for your project? Those things aren't always immediately obvious. And it's not like those are, in the documentation anywhere, but you can go back to the question about how much documentation there is. And you can also see if there's an active community online. For instance, you can Google your tool and tutorial and see how many results pop up. Also make sure you check how recent those results are, because that YouTube video from 2009 is probably not what you're looking for. So making sure that there's a lot of people actively participating in developing this tool or developing resources around it, and knowing that there are people that you can ask questions of who have practical experience with it. Those are really useful for thinking about those opportunity costs and that time investment. Now, some of the decisions that you have to make aren't really about pros and cons so much, in that they're not qualities that are inherently good or bad, but they do have a big impact on your project, so they're just as important. So for instance, does the purpose of the tool as it was designed align with the purpose of your project? A tool designed for data analysis can produce visualizations, but it's not necessarily the quickest or easiest way to do that if all you need is a graph or a chart. A tool for presenting an exhibit or a specific narrative is probably not the most sustainable option for actually preserving your materials. So even though tools have extensive functionalities beyond their main purpose, aligning those priorities and aims can be really helpful in streamlining your project. Another question is how much you can customize all the options. That could be anything from the appearance of the visualizations to the ability to run custom queries, really any facet of this tool, right? How much ability do you have to shape it and customize it? More options is not always better. A lot of times the ability to customize things makes the platform a lot more complicated. So there's a bigger time investment, even if you're not planning to use all those custom options, because it's going to ask you to make more decisions. On the other hand, sometimes a tool that's sort of out of the box doesn't do what you need it to do. So if you're willing to and able to invest that time, it can have really solid payoffs for your project. So there's really no value judgment there, just again, a question of those priorities. And another big one, what does the tool do with your data? With some tools, you download the program, it lives on your computer, and whatever data you put into it stays there. Although you should always read the terms and conditions when you install, because sometimes they are sneaky. But with web apps, where's your data actually going? Is it stored in a publicly accessible repository? Is it private for your use only? And on the flip side, if you want to share your data, does it make it easy to export it or to share it? There are cases where you might want your data to be accessible if you're working on something public facing or open access, or if you have a lot of collaborators. But there are also plenty of cases where you need to have control over who can access it and who can use it. So again, a question about your project and your preferences. So let's look at a few common matchups and see how some of these questions play out. A really common one is Omeka and Scalar. Both are web publishing platforms that allow you to create exhibits and narratives around specific items, but they're designed for very different purposes. Omeka is first and foremost for a tool for housing items and collections and attaching all the metadata to them. It's designed with libraries and archives and museums in mind. Scalar is more about the writing. It's a publishing tool that facilitates lots of different outputs, but is first and foremost about authorship. Now, both are free. Both are relatively easy to use. And so it really comes down to what your focus is. Is it the items and the collections themselves, or is it this narrative and argument that you're sort of using to frame them? Mapping's a really rich field in terms of applications, and you can see I've listed several here. And all four of these are popular options. But again, they do very different things. And they've each got some strong pros and cons. So if you're looking for data analysis and visualization, you might want a sort of high-powered GIS application like ArcGIS or QGIS. Both are going to allow you to manipulate data, to visualize it in lots of different ways, and to run lots of kinds of analysis. But having all those options means that there's a lot to learn about them, and sometimes that they require a lot of computing power. They've both got solid communities where you can find advice about sort of navigating all the tools and options. ArcGIS perhaps has more thorough documentation, and it's a little more refined, but it also costs a boatload if you do not have institutional access, whereas QGIS is open source. So again, a question both of your project and also the resources that are available to you. And if you don't need that high-powered stuff, then you've got some solid options with Neatline and Leaflet, but there are still questions about purpose. Neatline works with Omeka and maps out collections. It allows you to add sort of a spatial layer to your existing metadata. So it's great for storytelling, it's great for adding context to a collection, and it's got a really easy to use interface. Leaflet's very DIY, and you can customize it virtually infinitely. You can map out basically anything, and you can store it, you can house it virtually anywhere. But Leaflet's so customizable because it's basically just DIY code. There's no interface. And so that's a barrier to entry there. So thinking about the purpose of the program, thinking about the resources available to you, and of course, thinking about what kind of data and what kind of application you're using it for. And the same thing with data visualization. It feels like these tools in particular are proliferating madly. There's a huge data visualization community that's constantly coming out with new tools. And these are a few of the big ones right now. Here, the main distinctions for me are going to be presentation, interoperability, and cost. So Tableau and Flourish are very flashy. They produce really attractive visualizations, and they're very easy to customize the appearance of those visualizations. Palladio and NodeGoat, on the other hand, give you very plain visualizations, and you can't really customize the appearance at all, but you can customize the data a lot. They both offer a lot of flexibility for how you structure your data and how you build those connections within your data set. With Tableau and Flourish, you can export and embed your visualizations elsewhere, and you still get that sort of dynamic nature to them. With Palladio and NodeGoat, you have to screenshot it. So it's just a static image that then you can put on a website. But Palladio and NodeGoat allow you to share your data in a lot of different ways. And sometimes that's more important. So again, thinking about what the actual product is here. Finally, all of these have free levels, but with Tableau and Flourish, the free versions make your data public. Palladio is always free, and NodeGoat does have subscription levels, but your data privacy isn't something that you have to purchase. So again, what are your priorities? What do you need from these tools? And what's the actual output that you're looking for? So hopefully these questions help give you kind of a framework for evaluating tools that on the surface might appear to be really similar. Once you've picked one, then what? The structure of the tool is going to have a big impact on how you design your workflow. So of course, the first step is learning the tool. And if you've got a lot of time, or if you think you're going to want to use it a lot in the future, or if it's a really central piece of your project, you might want to learn it backwards and forwards. Read through all the documentation and user guides, watch the tutorials, etc. And there's a lot to be said for that if you've got the time. But more often, I find it's really more of sort of a triage approach where you need it to do some very targeted things and ideally do them relatively quickly. And in that case, those tutorials are your friend. I've listed a couple places to look here. The Programming Historian is especially good. And in general, these two are good because they're designed for academics rather than for industry. So they address a lot of the concerns that we might not even know that we have. And if those fail, you can always turn to YouTube because there's a huge community of YouTube creators producing these tech tutorials, and they are often a goldmine. So once you've got a sense of the tool and how it works, think about what it needs from you. What kind of data format does it need? How do you structure your data? If it's something like a website, how do you want people to experience it and navigate it? What are the pages, the subpages that you want, and how's it organized? What are the limitations of the tool that might make you rethink your plan? Or on the flip side, what are some of the surprising functionalities that you didn't know about that might open up some unexpected possibilities? The most important thing as you're going through all these questions is to write down your answers. As you start using any new tool, you're going to come up against these unexpected possibilities and unexpected challenges. So a lot of this process of tool evaluation, of sort of working these into your workflow, is iterative, just like so many other things in digital humanities. So filling out something like the intake form that we use in the Iris Center, or a project charter that lays out your project's goals and methods, is really important as a record of all the decisions that you have to make, because sometimes you might want to go back and make a different one. Often these documents, whether it's an intake form or a project charter or just, a random Word doc that you're putting things in, often these are a little bit aspirational, and I tend to think that's a good thing. But creating that written record of these decisions will help you articulate some of those priorities and those goals and help you sort of have a record of your project. So I'm going to stop talking at this point and I'm going to leave it here, and we can kind of open it up to a conversation. So if you have questions or comments or experiences, please do feel free to share. I will stop my screen share and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Meg. Yeah, let's talk. What kinds of topics or conversations or questions would you like to go with? But thank you also. I'll start by saying thank you for sharing with me DH reviews. I didn't know about it. I think it's great, and I think that I had a quick look. Whenever people share web link resources with me during a talk, it's dangerous because then I go and play with the resource that's just been shared. And I just had a quick look at linguistics reviews. There's not that many. There's only 3, but one of them is a project I know about, and so I took a look at the review, and it seemed like a really good overview, and I think there's a lot of potential there. And the process of submitting reviews looks pretty straightforward, and I would say of high standard enough that our own DH faculty could consider writing their own reviews of other resources and including that, on their CVs as part of their professional development. So it's something we could keep maybe sharing with IRIS faculty users going into the future.
Absolutely. It's a relatively new project. I think they got some NEH funding for it a couple of years ago, but it's a really important one because, of course, one of the barriers to DH in general is figuring out ways to evaluate projects and get that evaluation in some form. You can use it for promotion and
Exactly.
so yeah, I think it's a great resource. Yes, Joanna.
Building off of that, is there any intermediate communication in DH reviews? Is there any social media component before a project is completed and released on the world? Are the people in DH reviews talking before they critique a project?
Yes, so actually their process, I think, is a really ethical one in that, so you as a project creator can choose to submit your project for review. And then it gets sent to a reviewer. They will not publish it online if it's a negative review, because it's such a weird space, right? It's kind of halfway between a peer review and like a book review. And so, of course, this is a way to support scholars, support this kind of scholarship, but it also could become a way to sort of undermine scholars' contributions. And so they have a really nice set of guidelines for how reviewers should what kind of questions they should address, that they should always do so in a respectful kind of way. And there is a process there. So far as I know, there's not a social media component, but there is certainly a process in place to make sure that it's not just like a bunch of reviewers trashing, all the DH projects out there. The reviews themselves are reviewed, I think.
One thing I've been struggling with as I learn about tools is how tools, tool interoperability, how tools integrate with each other. And it's not great integration all the time. So
No.
It's one thing to learn a tool and kind of its strengths and its limitations, as you talked about, and contexts in which it might make sense. And then there's other times when I would like two tools to interact with each other. And in theory, they should. And in practice, they do not.
Yeah, interoperability. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joanna.
No. I was going to change the subject. So you say.
Oh, I was just going to say that interoperability is a conversation that's growing in the field. And of course, all the stuff around linked data, touches on some of that. But it also is a huge challenge because so many of these things are developed in silos and then sort of emerge into the world fully formed. And there's not always a lot of conversation between the creators. So, sometimes picking a tool is about a short term. I need a tool that does this thing and I need it ideally now. But I do also think that sometimes you've got to think about these tools as long-term investments, that picking a tool sometimes is about what's the best thing for this project now, but sometimes it's about, I have a research agenda that's going to do a lot of things around this sort of field, and what's the tool that gives me the most long-term potential, even if maybe it's not quite the best fit for this immediate project. So definitely some questions there too. Go ahead, Joanna.
So this is a beginner question, but I'll defend myself by saying that I'm asking this if we were going to be introducing students to it, although I really need to know too. And that is, can you describe to what extent the tools stand alone, or to what extent they need to be plugged into, I don't know if that's the right verb, an existing platform? Like, do these tools, can you use and access them from their source, or do you need to attach them to a WordPress site? Or and then my advanced beginner tag onto that is, I'm using Omeka. How welcoming is Omeka to the integration of these tools you mentioned? Or do you use the tools in isolation? I'm just wondering, how do we, I think I can imagine how to access the tools, but then how do we use the tools to build a project? Do we need an existing platform like WordPress or Omeka? And how welcoming is Omeka to those tools?
So the short answer is it depends. things like, so Omeka has a pretty good suite of plugins that you can use with it. So something like Neatline that I mentioned, which is that mapping tool, that just plugs right into Omeka, and you can add fields in your metadata for spatial data, and then you can sort of create your map. And there's other things like timeline tools that add on to Omeka. There's all kinds of things. Some of these are standalone. So some of them are sort of, the traditional download a program. Some of them are web applications that are sort of standalone. Some of them, like Leaflet, that's a map that you can create just with code on your computer and then just upload it anywhere. So there's a whole spectrum of possibilities there. And it really depends on what you want to do, on what kind of tool you're looking for. And I would say for students, the best thing is to kind of start with what you want and then work backwards to find the tool that does it. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, could you bring WordPress into the equation?
Yeah, sure. WordPress also has quite a few plugins that allow you to connect various things. WordPress is nice because it's great for having a sort of closed environment where students can play with things like, publishing, and can bring in lots of different resources and embed them. We did just discover yesterday that there are certain things that don't embed in WordPress. And WordPress can be a little finicky. It's got some weird quirks to it where every now and then it just doesn't like something.
I think some of that's tied to the themes. So, so WordPress is definitely a learning process, like everything else you've talked about today, Meg. It's a let's tinker with this for a period of time and learn through the mistakes we make. And that can be risky, obviously, if you're using it in the classroom with students, but if you have a fairly forgiving cohort of students who are along for the ride and their assessment is as much the experience as it is the output, then you can survive it. So that's what I'm going to say at the end of this semester about my experience with WordPress.
Yes, I would agree with that. But it depends a little bit on what the sort of learning goals are for the students, right? If you want them to produce a finished product that looks a certain way and is very polished, WordPress can do that, but you want to make sure that you've set some limitations on what they're doing in it. But if you want them to sort of figure out some of the problem-solving dimensions of digital humanities and the trial and error that is so much a part of it, WordPress can also be good for that if you just sort of set them loose on it. So, yeah. Really depends on those priorities. Sure, go ahead, Jen.
I'm most familiar with Omeka. I'm scared of WordPress. I'm not, I mean, I've used it, but I understand that it's a puzzle. What integrates well with Omeka that is not already an Omeka plugin, that's not already on the Omeka site as an option? Is there anything that integrates or talks to it easily that isn't already on Omeka?
You can integrate Omeka with Scalar. So if you want to do something along the lines of an exhibit or an article that is talking about a lot of things in your Omeka collection, you can link those two things.
And what would the advantage of that be?
Well, so Omeka has, as you're aware, it's got some fairly rigid restrictions on how you can kind of set up more interpretive resources, right? So you can do exhibits, you can do pages, but there's fewer options for how you can customize or how you can present those things. Scalar is really nicely set up for sort of multimodal publishing, right? You can do all kinds of things with it. You can integrate Google Maps, and you can pull things in from different sources. And so it's really flexible in ways that Omeka isn't. But if you want to keep those items in there with their metadata and keep them in the context of the collection and sort of link those two things, then that's a nice way to do it.
Thanks. And you're saying they play nicely together?
Yes, from what I have, so I will say I have not linked them myself, but I've been working with a few other people on doing this, and it seems like so far so good. So
Maybe that's a future brown bag, a Scalar Omeka link-up-a-thon kind of discussion.
yes, I think that's a
Because I'm
great idea.
intrigued by this as well for the Ron Schaefer project in the future, maybe.
Just gonna write that down.
I have to say, I'm talking to colleagues who do not have a DH center on their campus, or if they do, they don't have access to it, or there's some other obstacle. And so they're asking their colleagues like me, you know, I want to start an Omeka site. Where do I find support? And I have to say, well, go to the Omeka people, go to the Omeka mothership. And I have to say, you know, thank you so much for today. We're so lucky to have the Iris Center and help like this, because not everybody in my situation has this kind of support and help. And so thank you. I mean, one of the questions that I could ask you for them if they were in here is, I'm starting Omeka. I know to avoid omeka.net and go straight into the big one, but how do I get started, and how do I teach myself the lingo? Is there or are there other resources other than the learn how to use Omeka information pages on Omeka? Are there other, and I believe the Roy Rosenzweig Center even provides access to independent contractors or something like that that would help them through their centers, sort of like Blurb Books has independent designers who will help use that software. But is there another resource? Is there a DH Center for the Masses? Is there something like Iris for people who are not at SIUE that would help them get up to speed or start projects with either Omeka or these other tools?
Not that I'm aware of, in the sense of what you're describing, right? A DH Center for the Masses. There are public-facing digital humanities resources, but so much of this is wrapped up in institutional access that you're right. I mean, for independent scholars, it can be a serious barrier. I will say that actually, I think the Omeka user guides are really well done, but they're very thorough.
They are, and you have to have an established vocabulary to use them. It took me longer than it should have to understand the difference between an item and a file, for example.
Oh, yeah.
I just hope SIUE's administration is watching this and knowing what a nugget they've got in this Digital Humanities Center and how important it is, and how we're on the verge of really cracking into a really important time in the evolution of academic research, and continue to, you know, support you guys at higher and higher levels.
I think Meg's
really
presence
Thank
here
you for today.
Yeah,
Sorry?
Meg's presence here is testimony. I think that there is some degree of recognition, so that's encouraging. Although we could always use more.
Right.
Well, I mean, one possibility, Meg, I don't know, is if Joanna's friend could start by reaching out to their IT office, because for us, hosting a kind of central instance of Omeka through an IT, their university's IT gave some kind of centralized legitimacy to the platform, such that, you know, and some sustainability. But beyond that, in terms of, like you said, like learning to learn what you don't know without already having to learn the extra baggage of vocabulary and procedure. Other than that, it comes down to a lot of time invested in watching videos like this, you know, and probably hosts of other how-to videos or discussions that come out of other DH centers.
I will say too that a lot of DH centers, ours included, right, have students who are producing how-to guides. And sometimes those are videos, sometimes they're sort of walkthroughs where you don't have to watch things, which is always nice. And so there's a lot of that out there, and it's just about kind of tailoring your search to find it, because it's not always stored in really intuitive places. Omeka too has a pretty good community around it. So there are forums where if you ask a question, you can usually get a pretty prompt response. But again, you know, as you say, unless you want to use omeka.net, things like server access are always going to be a barrier too. So There are solutions to that also. You know, before I came here, in fact, I still keep all of my own Omeka stuff on a reclaimed hosting account, which is relatively inexpensive and opens up access to things like Omeka and Scalar when you don't have your own server to store them on. So there are workarounds, but they're rarely free, and they also take a little bit of knowledge. It's one of the unfortunate things about being an independent scholar, where you're paying to do the kind of work that really you should be being paid to do.
I wanted to, unless there's other questions, I think one thing we can do, you know, is think about the futures. Obviously, we're always thinking about the future, but I mean, next academic year, we'll have more brown bags coming up. We had thought about a series of themed brown bags and that, you know, data and people kind of, so that theme is still a possibility. But also, if you guys take away ideas where you, that you would like to see in future brown bags. For example, this idea of a Scalar Omeka link, we could, you know, the summertime is always a good time to explore possible and tinker with possible tools that we can then bring back to brown bags and talk about in a public forum in the future. I'm actually thinking about even pre topics, so topics that even precede what Meg brought up today, kind of very basics when you are thinking about working with digital tools and students, kind of how bringing it way back, some kind of very foundational things that you would like students to know and some best practices students should have before you even bring the DH tool into the classroom. So those are some ideas for the future, but if you take away from these things you would like to see in the future, please let us know.
And we can imagine different kinds of events as well. You know,
Yeah.
We've got these brown bags, but we could also think about if there's a particular skill or program or something that you want to spend some time on, you know, setting up weekly lunch sessions or something. We can do book clubs, we can do all kinds of things. So lots of possibilities. If you have ideas, please do bring them to us. Otherwise, you're stuck with whatever I come up with.
Or me, even worse.
Are there other questions or thoughts? See, we've got a few minutes left here.
I think we should just chat about bees.
Don't get me started.
Sure, Joanna, do you have another question?
Yeah, that just made me, reminded me that there's somebody doing research on bees' perception of time. Did you see that?
Oh, was that animal migration article in the New Yorker?
No, I'm sorry, it wasn't the New Yorker, it was Reddit. So sorry.
Which is actually,
Forget about it. It's not worth talking
that
about.
was, which was taken from TikTok, but anyway.
Other than the wide world, are there other, and I'm sorry I can't answer this immediately, so it's a question, it might be a failing in my memory. Are there other SIUE projects that we can see now that are published now using Omeka that we could look at? Because we have particular or peculiar access to those colleagues that are using Omeka as their primary platform?
There are several. So the most obvious one that comes to mind is the museum, which up until this point is sort of digital collections in Omeka Classic. They're currently in the process of migrating over to Omeka S, but you can still go look at the museum views. It's museumviews.siue.edu, and you can see some of their collections and exhibits. There are some other ones in development that I don't know if they're ready to talk about yet, but I think Madison Historical has some integration with Omeka.
Yeah, their actual encyclopedia is Omeka, I think, or maybe I'm getting it backwards, but they're half Omeka, half WordPress. So they have the digital repository of all of the items they've received from various donors, you know, documents, sound files, images, that kind of thing. So that's all Omeka.
those are the ones that come to mind, but there might be others as well.
I mean, I've used Omeka as a add-on digital repository for my Nepal earthquakes project, and it's mostly hosting a lot of additional materials that weren't part of the core objectives of the funded project. So we just had a bunch of extra like images and project derivatives and some other types of materials. So we used Omeka as a repository for that. So the main stuff went to the University of Virginia in a special collections, special digital collections in their library. But we had all this other stuff that wasn't committed to the University of Virginia that we created a repository for here.
Did Virginia do a customized platform for you, or
Yeah,
did you?
they have something they built on Drupal, and it was already kind of, so it's their Tibet and Himalayas digital collection. So you can imagine they had customized a lot of the cataloging and metadata to be more specific to languages and cultures of South Asia and the Himalayas.
Not to throw us down a rabbit hole too far, but I'm just curious. What is the maintenance like for them on a customized platform on Drupal for their collection?
Yeah,
mean,
they have a director and they have a few full-time staff positions. So, so the thing was kind of built already for me to go ahead and my students to upload audio, video, and transcripts. And they have a nice tool that time aligns the transcripts. If you do the transcription in a piece of software that does timestamps, the transcripts are time aligned to the audio and the video. And then there's all this metadata that you item type and topic metadata, regional coverage, all kinds of stuff that's tailored to that. And so you can imagine the director, David Germano, he has a bunch of staff positions that I was interacting with on a regular basis as we built this, because I came in kind of clueless to the whole process of depositing and had to have lots of conversations with their staff support to help me, add things the way that I needed to.
yeah. I'm reminded of the staff at the Bodleian saying, we have a staff here, we're not going anywhere, but there's only so much we can do. So we don't take everything that's offered to us.
Yeah, that's right. I had to agree with them. As I applied for the grant, I had to have a conversation with Germano and his staff about what they would take from me and how I should prepare it and format it. So there was front end work on my behalf to get the things in shape so that it could be ingested into that system.
Okay, we're going way in the weeds here, but I'm curious, is there anything you were not able to shift over into that project that's an orphan now? Are you holding on to stuff?
Yeah, so that's why I did the Omeka archive at SIUE. I had stuff that, when you do language documentation research, like any other research, you end up with a bunch of stuff that you never planned to get in addition. And that's either going to live in a shoebox, under my bed, or on a private hard drive, or else I have to figure out a way to deal with it. And I had money for students through the grant, so I was able to kind of pool their resources into putting together a local archive in Omeka. And I was familiar enough with Omeka that I could work with students to help me pull those materials in.
And did you publish that, or is it private still?
It's an SIUE Omeka page. I believe it's on our Iris page. So I can send you the link to it. It's uneven coverage. So for some of the languages we did work on, we have lots of material with really good metadata. And then for some of the other languages, it's not as fully fleshed out. And like with everything, the funding ended and the project ended. So it kind of is what it is for the moment. Anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack
No, thanks for that. That's interesting. So an advantage of using Omeka on your own or through SIUE is that you have the invisible Omeka team maintaining that end of it.
I can also tell you, Joanna, so I'll put this in the chat. This is a personal Omeka collection that I maintained for a while that I'm in the process of moving over to Omeka S. But it's just like family records. And so it's through Reclaim Hosting, which also actually provides its own support in addition to Omeka. So it's actually really good for that. And you can see it's really rudimentary as far as, it's just a standard out of the box theme. It's got a few things plugged in, like a timeline and a map, but it's very basic, but it is also completely DIY. So.
Sorry, I missed what you said, that it does something supplemental to Omeka. What is it?
Oh, Reclaim Hosting. So that's
I
just
see.
because I don't maintain my own server here. I just use a hosting. But so Reclaim Hosting is designed for academics. And so it's got a lot of applications built in that are good for scholarship and also for teaching.
Understood. Thank you.
So since we all have institutional access to Omeka and things like that, it's not so much of an issue, but for independent scholars, it's a good choice.
And then I just dropped another link in the chat, which is the Nepal earthquakes local. Well, that's a home page, a landing page, which has links to all the archive materials, both here and at University of Virginia.
So how would I get something like this peer reviewed if I wanted to do something kind of in the intersection of, journalism history and whatever else I research? How would I get it peer reviewed so something would count as creative or scholarly production for promotion?
So there are a few options. One is something general like reviews in DH, but a lot of journals are now doing project reviews. And so I have a list somewhere in my Google Drive of publications that are doing that. It's more tailored towards humanities and less social sciences, but I have a feeling that there probably are journals in mass comm that are doing similar things. So
mass comm can't make up its mind if it's a social science or a humanities discipline. I mean, there are plenty of journalism historians, and so what I've gotten interested in recently is attacks on journalists, violence against journalists, and to do a history of it, or even a sort of contemporary history, I think you might call it, with a little more depth. It might be more interesting and more useful and more publicly meaningful if it were put together as more of a database or timeline or combination of the two. But as a history project, as a humanities project. But then I'm not going to do it if it can't get peer reviewed and count towards promotion, right?
So I'll share my screen here. This is a document I have with some existing resources on peer review and digital humanities. And what you're describing sounds like it might be a fit for something like the Public Historian, which does reviews of digital exhibitions and things like that. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, but you can see there are several publications that are doing project reviews. And also up here, I've got some of the scholarly organizations that have put out guidelines for how to evaluate digital scholarship as it applies towards promotion and tenure and things like that. So there are resources out there. If you want, we can have a conversation about it at some point and think about what specifically might suit that project and what the various venues might be.
I'm just getting sick of not being a full-fledged social scientist, because the people who I see doing, for example, games research, I mean, they have basically two loads, and they have labs, and they're constantly doing, statistical analyses of experimental data, or they're doing surveys and more upon surveys. And I'm like, the data that I can get my hands on, the stuff I'm interested in doing, might be, combination of interview data and then also documents. Like, what if I could gather threats received by journalists? And I mean, then I would need to be better at Python perhaps to analyze. But anyway, I'm sorry to hijack and make it a personal, but if I'm interested in attacks against journalists and how to get it published in ways that are, not just in kind of banging my head against the social science journal wall, and also that are more publicly available when done. If I get a thing peer reviewed that is publicly available, that is not so much bound up in the whole academic publishing world, that would be a lot cooler and more meaningful to me, and probably more useful to the journalistic field, because everything's changing so fast with technology. But it's just
like another great idea for a future group discussion as well. This whole issue of peer review, for like you said, Mark, for the larger implications, but also for professional development implications. I think that this is an important conversation.
Yeah, and that's one that Jessica's working on a lot too.
Yeah.
She's got a peer review component in her current Recovery Hub project.
Mhm.
And that's where I'm seeing a lot of this shifting to, is sort of field specific, discipline specific venues, because as wonderful as something like reviews and DH is, you know, it's limited in its ability to put projects in conversation with other scholarship happening on those topics. And so you really have to have both kinds of things, both the general and the very specific venues.
You know, it's been a couple of years since I've looked at it, but the Faculty Senate at SIUE adopted a statement saying digital scholarship counts. It's a 2 short paragraph statement and it's very good. And I think the Iris Center should have it up on the wall, you know, for people going, I don't know if SIUE is going to count what I'm doing. You can say, yes, since 2013.
There's always the approach. If they didn't count it, I might sick the union on them and file a grievance or something. But like, I would rather it just, yes, let's make a poster.
Remember, you need a thing from Iris saying this, we've had a look and this is digital scholarship to go in a dossier, you know.
Yeah, and remember your next promotion has external anonymous reviewers, and it's not beyond the pale to say the candidate you wants the external reviewer to look at this one project. You know, when they can look at anything, but they're particularly proud of this one digital project, and they'll look at it and put it in their letter for you.
Cool.
I mean, I know that's a specific time hurdle thing, but that's possible too, if you're worried about the next jump.
But it is also just a general problem of the field. You know, it's one of those things where all of our individual fields and institutions are slowly catching up, but we do need more sort of streamlined processes in place for this.
Joanne, I wouldn't classify it as a worry. I would just say scholarship was the weak point in my promotion in getting tenure. And I had better reviews at CAS where people were like more open, I think, to open textbook publishing, the academic value of a textbook. And, you know, I did a lot of little things with a short enough peer review time that they would get in there before I went up for tenure. I mean, like encyclopedia entries and writing a subsection of a chapter for a friend who had a book on journalism ethics, and a lot of the stuff that I've been working on for years, you know, delightfully got published the year after I got tenure. And so, you know, maybe that stuff will count for promotion, but it also has to do with just having a meaningful academic life, like not doing stuff that just ends up in a social science journal that's about, you know, chasing the dragon of information and communication technologies. By the time you publish something about how journalists are managing technology, the field has moved on to the next technology that journalists have to manage. And so, yeah, I'm looking for something that's more meaningful, long-standing, public-facing, but still counts. So thank you for listening to me.
We want to work with you.
Yeah, and if you have, I mean, even just as a starting point, Meg, if you have a list of,
sure, I can absolutely send you the list I've got.
Yeah, of where to go for peer review. That I might, you know, it might give me some direction. But thank you for this presentation. It's nice to know that we have a Mecha S, right?
Mm-hmm. We do have a Mecha S, and
I can just download it. It looks like.
So you can choose to download it and host it yourself, but it does require a server. And since we already have an Iris instance, you can also just tag onto ours.
Okay, how do I do
we can set you up with
Yeah, you just reach out to Meg and she'll help you come up with like a URL name extension for it. And then it'll have the prefix of iris.siue.edu, and then it will have whatever you want to name it after that.
Our BioWire website. I mean, this is not exactly my first trip down this road, but thank you. Like I just presented for an hour on that. Were you paying attention?
You say we have to hear
conversation
times.
Well, it's good to see people, just in a general sense. Joanna, I used to see you in the hall like probably at least once or twice a week.
Well, I'm headed there today.
I'm not.
We'll see each other in person again.
Yeah. Christina, are you vaccinated? Should we still be talking, or do you just want to end this? I'm sorry.
Well, we can cut this part out. If you're recording, Meg, you can probably.
Yeah,
just
here, I'll stop the recording, but I'll probably also just trim it a little bit anyway.
edit this.
So.
Yeah, a little bit. That's